avoid putting the teachers in an awkward position. Is presents that are extravagant bribery? Should teachers be getting gifts at all? Do send us your thoughts. Just use the hashtag BBC The Briefing. Once again, we begin with Brexit, and Britain's Prime Minister Theresa May will be pleading with MPs to back her deal as the government is embroiled in a constitutional row with Parliament. Mrs May will begin 5 days of debate in the House of Commons on her Brexit plan before the crunch vote, which is on December the 11th. But before she even addresses MPs, her government will come in for intense criticism over claims it's in contempt of Parliament by refusing to publish the full legal guidance given to ministers about the withdrawal agreement. Well, all of this is due to unfold through the day in Westminster. Let's go to Kasia Madeira, who is there now. Kasia, it's becoming a cliché, but it's another critical day for Theresa May.
Oh, Sally, I'm running out of cliches, and I'm really interested to see what our political correspondent is going to use, Rob Watson. He's the man with so many fantastic analogies. How is he going to describe today? Because, yes, I was expecting to start the day here at Westminster talking to you about the start of these 5 days of debate, intense debate about the deal that MPs will be voting on a week today. They only have 5 days, and they've got 8 hours each day allocated for this parliamentary business to discuss the debate, the deal that Theresa May really needs to get voted through next Tuesday, just a week today. And yet, we're starting the day by talking about this issue of contempt of Parliament. 6 opposition parties called this motion yesterday late at night, and the Speaker agreed to put this through. And they're saying this intervention by the Speaker is commanding the support of 324 MPs at the moment, and it's all about the figures, because these figures, really lots of people are saying that these figures, the numbers, could actually indicate what's going to happen in terms of the vote on the deal itself. So it's a fascinating situation. The opposition motion would defer government ministries to the opposition motion to the Standards and Privileges Committee for contempt, and that committee could consider a range of sanctions, even expelling the ministers. It's all a little bit vague because we're not quite sure exactly who the ministers are, what this really does refer to. So we're in an extraordinary situation, and, well, the day is only just beginning. And yes, like I said, we're beginning with the contempt of Parliament rather than the debate on the deal itself. My colleague Rob Watson looks at the day's unfolding events.
Theresa May has been touring the country and the TV studios trying to sell her Brexit deal. But today she'll face the most demanding audience of all, her fellow politicians. But just before she begins the 5 days of debate on her deal, MPs will discuss whether her ministers are in contempt for failing to publish the legal advice which Parliament demanded last month. Last night, the Commons Speaker granted an emergency debate to be held around lunchtime today.
I have considered the matter carefully, and I am satisfied that there is an arguable case that a contempt has been committed.
If Theresa May is defeated and government ministers are found in contempt, this is likely to be seen more as a distraction than a disaster. A committee of MPs would have to consider what action to take. The government's accusing opposition politicians of playing politics.
I think it's a complete diversion from what the public are expecting to hear. We're going to have 5 days of important debate about the merits of Brexit, the withdrawal agreement. Let's get on with that and stop messing about with process.
What is significant is that one of the opposition parties who want to see the legal advice is none other than Northern Ireland's DUP, and their MPs usually prop up the Prime Minister's minority government. So this could be the shape of things to come. The really big vote isn't today, it's next week when MPs decide whether to back the Brexit deal. But today's debate may give a clue to the scale of opposition that the Prime Minister is likely to face. Ian Watson, BBC News, Westminster.
Yes, as Ian was saying, today's debate could indicate what is going to happen next week. Let's discuss this further with Professor Tony Travers from the London School of Economics, part of the London University Group here in the UK. Thank you so much for joining us so early. What we saw yesterday, we were talking about cliches and the drama of what happened, but having the Attorney General come to address MPs, that was, well, it's historic.
It's very unusual. It has happened before, but it's very unusual for the Attorney General, who is the government's chief law officer, in effect, inside the government, come to Parliament and make the case, really, for why the particular version of the advice that's been given to the government about the Brexit process should be published only as a summary. So it's all about whether the summary is produced or whether the whole document. Now, back in November, the Parliament voted that the whole of the advice given to the government should be published, and of course at that time the Conservatives didn't vote against that, so it went through unanimously. We're back in Parliament now, we're up against the time for the debate about the whole process of what happens next, and yesterday MPs managed to convince, later in the day, the Speaker of the House of Commons, who effectively chairs the House of Commons, that there should now be a debate on whether the Attorney General's holding Parliament in contempt for not publishing the whole document.
But the argument here is that he has client privilege, doesn't he? Because he's giving the government legal advice, and from that kind of context, he has client privilege in not having to disclose absolutely everything. But of course, everyone's not happy.
Absolutely. I mean, what he's arguing, you're absolutely right, as any lawyer would, that there is a public interest or a client interest in not publishing the whole document. However, all the parties in Parliament, other than the Conservatives, signed up to this motion, and there's likely to be some, even Conservative members, very strongly pro-Brexit, who want to see this advice as well. So at the moment, what this is doing is acting as a kind of enormous sideshow to the main business, which is moving on to the 5-day debate, which you mentioned earlier, about the wider process of Brexit and whether Mrs May's deal should in the end be voted through.
And that comes in a week's time. When we're just, in terms of this contempt of Parliament, the building behind us, when we're talking about the next stage, if ministers are found to be in contempt, what happens? What's the process?
Well, I mean, not only has this proposal been put down, but the government itself has put down an amendment to try to kick it all into the long grass. So we are deep into parliamentary procedure here. But if in the end Parliament votes through on this motion in favour of the one that the opposition's put down, then it would appear that there's a possibility, if the process moves forward, that either the Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox, or a government minister, probably the Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington, effectively the Deputy Prime Minister in the UK, would be suspended from the House of Commons. And this all, of course, is in the name of getting the full document published. So then the government would have to decide whether or not to publish the document. That argument will still to be had.
And just briefly looking forward then to Tuesday, of course we've got this week of intense debate once it eventually gets started. Yeah. Which way do you think it's going to go?
Well, I think what this tells us is that it's going to tell us about the power between Parliament and the government. And if Parliament really does appear to be getting power and getting traction here, it will convince the government, I suspect, even more than people are already, that Mrs May is going to find it very hard to win.
Professor Travers, fascinating insight. Professor Travers from the London School of Economics, and of course we'll be here throughout the day to look at all the different minutiae, and it's a fascinating insight into what has been happening and just how intense the whole Brexit debate has been here in the UK.
OK, Kasia, thank you for now. We'll have more from Kasia a little later in the programme. The body of former US President George H.W. Bush is lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda following a sombre ceremony. The event was attended by Mr. Bush's family along with senior officials. Several hours after the ceremony, President Trump paid his respects along with his wife Melania. Our correspondent in Washington, Rajini Vaidyanathan, reports.
For George H.W. Bush, it was the final journey to Washington, D.C., a city to which he devoted much of his life. With his son, America's 43rd President George W. Bush, watching on, the casket of the country's 41st was carried up the steps of the US Capitol building, accompanied by a 21-gun salute. President Trump, who Mr. Bush reportedly didn't vote for, paid his respects with his wife Melania. Republicans and Democrats and politicians past and present lined up to pay tribute.
In all of his 94 years, President Bush never lost his love of adventure, and he never failed to answer the call to serve his country.
And that call began as a teenager when he enlisted in the US Navy. His plane was shot down over the Pacific, and he survived.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
President George Herbert Walker Bush was a consummate public servant. Before he entered the White House, he was a congressman, the head of the CIA, and vice president to Ronald Reagan. President George H.W. Bush's casket will lie in state here at the U.S. Capitol building in Washington until Wednesday morning, giving members of the public their chance to say a final goodbye. Then it will move to Washington's National Cathedral, where America's 41st president will be afforded a full state funeral. Regina Vaidyanathan, BBC News, Washington.
Let's brief you on other stories in the news today. The French Prime Minister is to meet representatives of the Yellow Vest anti-government protests today. He's cancelled his trip to the climate summit in Poland and spent Monday meeting political leaders to discuss the wave of protests which have turned increasingly violent. An elderly woman died in Marseille after being hit by a tear gas canister. Two jailed Catalan separatist leaders have announced they're going on hunger strike from today, joining two colleagues who stopped eating at the weekend. Joaquim Forn and Joseph Rull are protesting at the refusal by the Constitutional Court to let them appeal to European courts against their pre-trial detention. The Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan has criticised recent sanctions imposed by the United States against Venezuela over alleged human rights abuses. During his first official visit to Caracas, President Erdogan said that trade restrictions and sanctions were wrong and only created further instability. Stay with us on the briefing. So much more to come, including, it is official, the Croatia and Real Madrid midfielder Luka Modric is the best male footballer in the world and awarded the Ballon d'Or.
It's quite clear that the worst victims of this disaster are the poor people living in the slums which have sprung up around the factory.
I am feeling so helpless that the children are dying in front of me and I can't do anything.
Charles Manson is the mystical leader of the hippie cult suspected of killing Sharon Tate and at least 6 other people in Los Angeles.
At 11 o'clock this morning, just half a metre of rock separated Britain from continental Europe. It took the drills just a few moments to cut through the final obstacle. Then Philippe Cosette, a miner from Calais, was shaking hands and exchanging flags with Robert Fagg, his opposite number from Dover.
This is the briefing on BBC News. The headlines. President Trump has paid respects to George H.W. Bush, whose body is lying in state in the US Capitol Rotunda. And British MPs are to vote on whether the government is in contempt of Parliament by not publishing the full legal advice it's received about the Prime Minister's Brexit deal. Well, let's go live to Westminster once again. My colleague Kasia Madeira is there. Kasia, over to you.
Sally, many thanks. Well, we're talking about dramatic days yesterday here at Westminster. Today, yet another dramatic day, because of course we were expecting to start the day by discussing the debate, the start of this 5 days of debate about Theresa May's deal, which will be voted on in a week's time today. In fact, we are talking about the impact of this contempt of Parliament that has been motioned forward, and that is in fact what MPs are going to be discussing. And we're describing this as a tussle, as a fight between Parliament flexing its muscles and the government. A fascinating fascinating insight, but of course ultimately we need to know how this is going to affect everyday people in every walks of life, and the business industry is really concerned about what is going on. Uncertainty, we all know, Sally, we talk about it a lot, that business does not like uncertainty. I'm joined by Brian Connell. He's a supply expert from KPMG. Again, I don't want to use that phrase dramatic, but I've got to. What's been going on there? What concerns do you have with what MPs are deciding, what they're debating about, what you saw yesterday?
I think businesses, and the businesses we work with, spend most of their time worrying about the uncertainty, and in particular trying to make sure that they have enough product in place in the UK so that if there are disruptions, if we do end up with difficulties as we come out of the EU, then at least we've got products in place to satisfy their own customers.
How do you put that contingency planning into place then when there are so many uncertainties?
Many businesses have been working at this for a little while now, and they've taken the view, many of them, that there won't be enough certainty, and when there is, it'll be too late. So they've created plans based on their forecasts of the future, and some businesses even have a programme that says we're creating our own certainty. That's the name of the projects that they're giving it.
Are you feeling that businesses, when you're talking to your fellow colleagues, are they confident in what is happening in terms of the political circles?
I think many of them find it quite baffling, to be honest, and the businesses who are based away from the UK but have got a presence here find it even more confusing. I mean, bluntly, it is quite a complicated process, and for that reason they focus more on their own businesses, on their own contingency plans, and try and leave the politicians to themselves. That said, they really would like a deal to be done, and they'd like a deal to be done as soon as possible. And when it comes to, of course, workers, we were talking about migration figures recently, the European migration dropping, the rest of the world coming, levelling that out. Are they getting the workforce they need? I think at the moment, but it's been getting very tight, and particularly tight in different sectors. Issues like drivers, for example, there's been a structural shortage in the UK for many years anyway. It'll be very interesting to see for people who maybe go back after Christmas or for a Christmas break, whether everybody returns. But let's be in no doubt, in certain sectors there is a real shortage already, and we'll see that coming through wage increases. Brian, in that case, many thanks for taking the time to speak to us. Brian Connell from KPMG, of course, just an insight there into how businesses are tackling and coping with this uncertainty. And, of course, later on today, we're going to hear a lot more about what is going to be happening in the Palace of Westminster behind us. Initially, starting with that debate about the Contempt of Parliament motion, and then finally going on to the debate itself about Theresa May's Brexit deal, which, of course, parliamentarians will be voting on Tuesday next week, before it then goes, of course, back to Brussels. Thank you, Kasia. We will see you later. But now let's take a look at other stories. The biggest exercise of military robots in British history is underway, with remote-controlled tanks among 70 new weapon systems being tested out. The 4-week war game, dubbed Exercise Autonomous Warrior, features a host of drones and armoured vehicles which can be operated from a distance as the army intensifies its efforts to keep up in a new tech-driven global arms race. Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale has been to see the robots in action.
This is the future of warfare. Out on Salisbury Plain, the British Army and its allies are learning how to fight alongside robots, both on the ground and in the air. This Warrior armoured vehicle would normally be driven by a soldier. Here, it's all being controlled remotely from this box. And this is the first robot in Britain to be fitted with a remotely operated gun, here being sent into potential danger in advance of US troops. But this technology still comes with risks, and as yet unanswered ethical questions.
Britain says it has no intent to develop lethal autonomous weapons, what some call killer robots. But as this technology develops, some will ask, who's really in control? Is it the man or the machine?
We would never use autonomous vehicles that could go out there and do stuff without a human being able to control it.
There are already calls for a ban on lethal autonomous weapons, but as yet there are no laws regulating or preventing their use. And there are fears this could be the beginning of a new arms race, with no one yet certain as to where it'll lead. Jonathan Beale, BBC News, Salisbury Plain.
Now let's bring you up to date on the latest sports stories.
Hello, I'm Mark Edwards. Here's what we've got coming up on your Tuesday sports briefing. The Madrid midfield maestro Luka Modric is the 2018 Ballon d'Or winner, but there's a twerking controversy at the ceremony. And as we're now in December, we've obviously got some skiing Santas for you, of course. Manchester City are top of the English Premier League. They're still unbeaten, and they take on Watford on Tuesday. But what's the key to their success? Is it that Pep expects perfection? Well, to help you make your decision, here's a verdict on forward Raheem Sterling, score of 8 goals and 6 assists already so far this season.
He can do better. We are so delighted what he has done in 3 years, but he can do better.
In what way?
More consistent, and first controls and his receptions, many things.
It's official. Luka Modric is the best football player on the planet. Having been crowned the best FIFA men's player back in September, he won the 63rd edition of the Ballon d'Or to finally put an end to the Messi-Ronaldo duopoly, which had seen them share the prize for the last 10 years. Modric's mirabilis included leading Croatia to the World Cup final and winning the Champions League. France and PSG striker Kylian Mbappe won the Coppa Award for Best Young Player. The 19-year-old starred as France won the World Cup and also won the Best Young Player Award in Russia. The Lyon and Norway striker Ada Hegerberg won the inaugural Women's Award. There was controversy, though, as her win was slightly overshadowed when she was asked to twerk by the host. Have a watch.
Et on allait faire un truc un peu comme ça. Est-ce que tu sais twerker?
No. He came to me after and he was really sad that it went that way. I didn't think about it in that moment. I didn't consider it as a sexual harassment or anything. I was just happy to get a dance and celebrate winning the Ballon d'Or, to be honest.
Well, the man who asked her to twerk, host and DJ Martin Solveig, has apologised in a video on social media. He says it comes from a distortion from his level of English and also his cultural understanding of it. He didn't know it could be considered such an offence and has apologised. Our future looks a little brighter for Australian cricket. Check this out. This is Ollie Davies, the New South Wales Metro captain. He smashed 207 off 115 balls against Northern Territory in the Under-19 One-Day Championships on Monday. Highlight what you're seeing right now, 6 sixes in 1 over. He hit no fewer than 17 in total. And you can get all the latest sports news on our website at bbc.com/sport. But from me, Mark Edwards, and the rest of the sport team, that's your Tuesday sport briefing.
That is indeed. Our thanks to Mark for that. Now, we have got plenty more for you here on the briefing. All the business stories, of course, to come in a moment, and our news briefing. And in that conversation, I'll be joined by Jeremy Thompson-Cook of World First. We're talking about a story in the Times newspaper about how one independent school in London has asked parents to keep their gifts for teachers at a maximum of £50. For teachers, because it puts teachers in a very awkward position. The article talks about in some private schools where teachers are being given dinners in Michelin-star restaurants. They're being given Mulberry handbags, luxury goods, and how this has all got out of control. So we asked you for your views on all of this, and as ever, you have not held back. We've heard from so many people. We've got Michael Smith, who says because of the extreme pressure on teachers, they find themselves today in difficult situations. Bottles of alcohol as presents should be avoided. Of course, you would say, unlike Parliament, alcohol should be avoided in the workplace. The results are obvious. We've got many who've said just £5 for a gift is absolutely plenty. We've heard from some viewers who say, actually, Keith, he says £50, that's far too much. It should be just a card made by the child only. We have another viewer who says, actually, I made mince pies for my favourite teachers. Many are suggesting baking, homemade goods, homemade cards. Keep your views coming in. Are you one of those who is for the expensive gift for teachers? I haven't heard from you yet this morning. I'll see you in a moment for Business Briefing.
Hello, it's a colder, quieter spell of weather for Tuesday, but then from Wednesday our weather becomes more active again, wetter, windier, but also milder for a time. Now we are in a gap between weather systems. Here's the next one coming in, not really showing much of a hand until Tuesday night and into Wednesday. In that gap between weather systems though, Tuesday starting with a widespread frost, the most widespread frost of the week, so it's -6 in Highland Scotland, a few mist and fog patches around too, and a risk of ice on untreated surfaces through northern and western Scotland, where we've had a few showers overnight, wintry on hills, some of these continuing to at least the first part of Tuesday. But for many of us in the day ahead, it is dry. It is sunny, but it is cold, for most around 4 to 7 degrees. Cloud increasing ahead of our next weather system coming in towards the southwest, giving some rain in the far southwest of England to end the afternoon. And then through Tuesday evening and night, this is slowly moving northwards across more of England, across Wales and into Northern Ireland. But ahead of that weather system to the north of it then, temperatures will drop away again for a frost, a few fog patches. And again, it is coldest in Highland Scotland, -6, -7 as Wednesday begins. It is less cold, though, where you're getting that rain moving in. And it continues to advance northwards on Wednesday, though still some uncertainty about how far north. Cold enough for some snow into the Pennines, southern uplands, maybe the higher ground north of the central belt, should it get that far north, though northern Scotland looking like staying dry on Wednesday and sunny. Rain clearing from Northern Ireland, but hanging around much of England and Wales as it slides its way eastwards, and a big range of temperatures from north to south across the UK, but turning milder, particularly across parts of England and Wales once again. Further weather fronts close by on Thursday, so expect a good deal of clouds, some outbreaks of rain or showers pushing east. And then to end the week, a deepening area of low pressure for Friday running across, looks like the northern half of the UK. And this is where we're going to see the strongest winds, potentially disruptive winds with gales, severe gales affecting parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England and Irish Sea coast. We'll keep you updated on that. It is still quite mild, although into the weekend behind that weather system, things will turn colder once again. So for the rest of the week, after the colder, quieter interlude, wet and windy at times, potentially stormy to end the week, but it will be turning milder for a time. That's your latest forecast.
Join Simon McCoy as he brings you the top stories live.
The ball is entirely in the UK's court. We could have got our tennis correspondent to report on this.
The latest in sport.
Heaven knows how they're dealing with this on the court.
The heat or the wind? I'm not quite sure.
Well, both.
The day's weather.
It's getting colder.
And undeniable chemistry.
He's still laughing.
We have to talk to each other.
There's only one Simon.
So you're the real McCoy.
Afternoon Live with Simon McCoy, weekdays at 2 p.m. on the BBC News Channel.
I'm Catty Kane, Washington.
I'm Christian Fraser in London.
Let's start with
the European Union, Brexit,
Russian interference,
Donald Trump's Twitter feed.
We'll
move on.
I think there are going to be a lot of questions now.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be fascinating to watch.
We're nearly out of time.
This is a big deal.
Beyond 100 Days, Monday to Thursday on the BBC News Channel.
Follow the story, whatever you're, wherever you are. You can follow every moment in depth with BBC News. Get the full story at bbc.co.uk/news. Get the headlines as they happen with the breaking news alert. And keep up with events by watching the BBC News Channel in the app. Follow the story wherever you are with BBC News.
This is your business briefing with me, Sally Bundock. Executives from Germany's 3 big car makers head to Washington for talks. Can they throw a spanner in the works as the White House considers steep tariffs on imported cars? The US-China trade truce mystery. Share markets rally grinds to a halt with no word from Beijing on car imports or the tariffs ceasefire. So let's show you the state of play for Asian markets. As you can see, losses pretty much across the board, and US futures indicate Wall Street will open lower today. However, the price of oil continues to rise ahead of the OPEC meeting later this week. Now, while the focus in recent days has been on the US-China trade, Donald Trump's threat to slap tariffs on car imports from Europe has not gone away. So there is intense interest in a meeting later today between top executives from 3 of Germany's biggest car makers and senior Trump administration officials at the White House. So let's bring you some information so you can get a sense of the context here. So European manufacturers sold almost $54 billion worth of cars in the US last year, making the auto industry one of the biggest earning categories. Sales in the US accounted for more than 14% of BMW, Daimler sales last year, rather less in terms of Volkswagen by some measures, the world's biggest car maker. Now, President Trump is threatening to increase the current 2.5% tariff on EU-built cars to 25%, and that compares with a 10% tariff for US-made cars when they enter the European Union. President Trump says the tariffs are about protecting American workers, the 3 German firms employing more than 41,000 people across the US, and that could rise if BMW goes ahead with reported plans for a second factory over there. But on the eve of the talks, Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel reminded the 3 manufacturers that Brussels is in charge of negotiating the bloc's trade policy.
These trade issues are unanimously decided by the European Commission for all member states. At the same time, the German car makers are big employers in the United States. So there's clearly reason to talk to the US administration about issues such as investment and the future of the German car makers as employers in America.
Well, we've got Holger Schmieding with us, Chief Economist at Berenberg Bank. Good to see you, Holger. You're listening there to Angela Merkel. What will these executives achieve in the White House today, do you think?
If they are lucky, they can impress upon Trump how many jobs these German car makers create in the US, how much they intend to invest in the US, how often they are using the US as a platform to build cars and then export them to China. But of course, they cannot negotiate on behalf of the European Union in any way.
But they could maybe sort of lay a foundation for more conciliatory talks in the future. But having said that, though, when you just look at the bare facts, you know, the tariffs on US-made cars going into Europe are that much higher at the moment than the other way around.
Yes, they are, but if you look at SUVs, for instance, it's the other way around. If you look at many other products, it's the other way around. The European Union has offered long ago to just scrap all of these tariffs, and it was actually Donald Trump who, upon coming to office, scrapped the agreement between the US and the European Union to scrap all tariffs and liberalize trade. So Trump basically has a problem of his own making.
In terms of how the trade tariffs sort of discussions are going on between the US, between China, I mean, obviously there's this sort of mystery at the moment as to whether China is dropping its tariffs on US-made cars going into China. But given how things are playing out with President Trump right now, what do you think might happen with regards to the EU negotiations?
At least it would be typical Trump if he were to threaten the tariffs, give Europe, for instance, say 3 months to do something, but then in the end, hopefully, in negotiations he would back down. But he is a very loud guy, so loud threats from him are to be expected.
If he were to go ahead with his threat of a 25% tariffs on cars coming from Germany, from Europe into the States, what impact would it have on these companies, the likes of BMW, Daimler, etc., and the German economy?
It would have a significant impact on these companies. It would have some impact on the European economy and the German economy, less so because cars are so important, but because it would send a signal about the future direction of trade policy, a very worrying protectionist signal. And as economies who need foreign trade a lot, Germany and much of Europe, such a signal would be pretty bad. Having said that, it would also hurt the US. And the EU, in terms of trading power, is as big as the US, and the EU would strike back.
But for the car companies themselves, there are some of them, like BMW yesterday, warning about 2019, just saying all these headwinds, the tariffs, potential tariffs, the change in exchange rate, strong euro, etc., rising commodity prices will weigh on their earnings in 2019. Also increase restrictions and regulations in terms of how these cars are put together in Europe.
Yes, the car companies are facing a lot of headwinds, and the trade worries are probably one of the biggest headwinds for them. Having said that, if we can avoid genuine trade wars next year, and I still hope we can so, because the US would otherwise be hurting as well ahead of Trump's potential re-election. If we can avoid that, there are also tailwinds. The biggest tailwind is that all in all, demand for quality products, including quality cars around the world, is great. Many emerging markets that are having a crisis this year are likely to come out of crisis next year. So if we can get over the trade war threat, the outlook even for cars is not very bad.
All right, Holger, thank you for coming in. It's been great to have you on the programme. We'll keep an eye on how those talks go. We'll update you if we hear any news. Now, as I've already mentioned, there is quite a bit of confusion over what was actually agreed between China and the US on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Argentina. Beijing has refused to confirm or deny claims by US President Trump that it's to reduce and remove tariffs on US car imports. So let's try and get our heads around the latest on this. Go live to Shanghai to speak to Robin Brandt once again. Robin, what do we know now? I mean, you and I were discussing this yesterday, and that the silence from China was deafening.
Yeah, I think some were heralding a kind of a market-calming deal agreed across the table in Buenos Aires. We certainly know that US moves to escalate with tariff increases during January. That's going to be postponed. There's a 90-day period now for negotiations. But look, I think there are now 4 different versions emanating from people in the White House of what was agreed at the table between President Xi and President Trump. And it is very confusing. I mean, we've got President Trump tweeting yesterday that China is going to reduce and then remove tariffs on auto imports from the US, so that's down from 40% to 25%. There's been nothing from Chinese official sources, government ministries in response to that, not confirming it, not denying it. Yesterday, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs just talked about both sides instructing teams to work towards removing tariffs. We've got Larry Kudlow, the President's senior economic advisor, saying overnight, it is his understanding, I believe that commitment was made on auto tariffs. He has said. Now, he was a man at the table, so he's pretty clear on that. But then we got another senior advisor, a guy called Peter Navarro, who refused to confirm that the issue of reducing auto import tariffs came up. Auto tariffs was confirmed. It certainly came up, he said, but he would not confirm whether that agreement had been made by President Xi Jinping or other senior figures in China. There's confusion over auto tariffs, confusion over the timeline as well for these negotiations. Is it 90 days starting now, 90 days starting January the 1st? I mean, look, it's just not clear. And I spoke briefly with some figures at Ford Motor Company this morning, obviously a very big player in the auto market globally. They said they were encouraged by the discussions, but they are now looking forward to learning more. And I think that captures the sense of confusion over what actually has been agreed.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Robin, for clarity on that. Let's brief you now on some of the other business stories. France and Germany have reportedly cancelled plans for an EU-wide tax on technology firms. The Financial Times says Paris and Berlin will instead present a draft plan today to impose a 3% tax on revenues generated by advertising sales in the digital economy. It says it would be likely to exclude giants such as Amazon and Apple. The online retailer Amazon briefly became Wall Street's most valuable company on Monday, just days after Microsoft dethroned Apple. Amazon rose at 4.7% at one point, putting its market capitalization at $865 billion. And Elon Musk's firm SpaceX has launched 64 small satellites into orbit, a record number for the US. The Falcon 9 took off from California on what's been described as the largest ever ride-sharing mission on a US rocket. The satellites belong to 34 different companies, government agencies and universities. So let's quickly look at financial markets. So a very different picture to what we saw this time yesterday. That's the Wall Street bounce off the back of the thought that the US and China's done a deal on trade. But as you can see, the doubts are being felt across Asia, in particular Japan, with an over 2% decline at the moment in Tokyo. That is your business briefing. Transport Secretary Chris Grayling should take some responsibility for the chaos around the introduction of new rail timetables in May, according to a report by MPs. Thousands of journeys were cancelled or severely delayed as the new schedule went live. The Transport Select Committee says genuine change is now needed to restore trust in the railways. Our correspondent Tom Burridge has more.
The stories we reported back then
I have this dread every single morning because I know that the train's probably going to be late.
Haven't been totally resolved. Throughout the autumn, services have again been reduced on Northern Rail, but the disruption in May and June on both Northern and Govia Thameslink was on another scale. Today, MPs on the Transport Select Committee say Chris Grayling should have done more to mitigate the disruption. They acknowledge the Transport Secretary wasn't fully informed by rail bosses, but say he's responsible for the management structures which failed.
The Transport Secretary, whilst we don't hold him responsible for this, we don't think he can absolve himself of any responsibility for what went wrong.
The report says disabled passengers were, at the time, simply unable to travel by train. Policies are needed to help them if things go wrong again. Many passengers have received compensation, but the MPs say a quicker, simpler system for claims is needed, and they believe fares on parts of the network affected should be frozen and not rise by 3.1% in the new year. Tom Burridge, BBC News.
There's more detail on that story on the BBC News app. Do take a look, including, of course, the pressure on the Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, as you were just hearing, who is seen to need to take more responsibility for the rail chaos that many had to endure in 2018. Breakfast is at 6 o'clock with Dan and Naga again today for the latest. You're with the briefing on BBC News. The headlines. Britain's MPs are to vote on whether the government is in contempt of Parliament by not publishing the legal advice it's received, the full legal advice, should we say, about the Prime Minister's Brexit deal. And President Trump has paid respect to George H.W. Bush, whose body is lying in state in the US Capitol Rotunda. The French Prime Minister has cancelled his trip to the climate summit in Poland. Is due to meet representatives of the Yellow Vest anti-government protests. So what is the media making of some of these stories and others? If we start in France, and one of its main dailies, Le Figaro, has the headline, "Under pressure, the executive prepares for a way out of the crisis." It talks about President Macron still trying to avoid a new Black Saturday and more protests over fuel prices. It calls the political efforts a damning operation and has involved talks and politicians and more communications with leaders of the Yellow Vest protests. In the UK, Brexit, of course, and the campaign for the second referendum dominates the Independent's political coverage, picturing the Green Party's Caroline Lucas, Labour's Chuka Umunna and Conservative Justine Greening. The three of them say they have at least 1 million signatures calling for another vote. Gulf News anticipates more political fallout from Qatar's decision to leave OPEC, quoting a tweet by the UAE's Minister for Foreign Affairs. He claims Qatar's move is proof of its declining role and isolation, says he expects more media attacks on OPEC from Qatar. And then after the G20 meeting and President Trump's meeting with China's leader, Bloomberg is talking about Trump's advisors who are struggling to explain the deal. He says he cut with President Xi. It says plans to reduce tariffs on US car exports doesn't exist on paper and hasn't been confirmed in Beijing. And then the New York Times looks ahead to the auction of Albert Einstein's so-called God letter. It explains in one paragraph why he doesn't believe in God or the Bible. It's reckoned it could fetch up to $1.5 million. And then finally, The Times. One fee-paying school has told its parents not to spend more than £50 on a teacher for Christmas, just under $70 on gifts. It came after some teachers were given a table at a Michelin-rated restaurant for the teacher and partner, or designer handbags. The senior editor of the Good School Guide said the policy was particularly joyless. We have Jeremy Thompson-Cook with us today, Chief Economist at World First. Good morning.
Good morning.
I hope you're well.
I am, very well.
So let's get stuck in. We have this main daily in France, Le Figaro. It says, under pressure to prepare a way out of the crisis.
Yeah.
Where is the exit from this crisis? I mean, it says they are looking for answers for a resolution, but it would seem nobody knows what they are at the moment.
No, they don't. And to be honest, there may be a meeting between the so-called leaders of these yellow jackets, although this is a fairly kind of disparate group of anti-government protesters, whether they've come out simply because they don't like Emmanuel Macron or they don't like this carbon tax that he's trying to impose to try and bring in some money into government coffers and therefore try and be more green within government. There may be a meeting later on today.
I mean, even that's not clear, is it? Whether some of these, those who represent the Yellow Jacket movement will actually get to this meeting. Some of them are saying they're not going, they're receiving death threats.
They've got death threats on the basis that they shouldn't be kowtowing or at least meeting with government, that more pressure needs to be put on the Macron government in the short term before any dialogue is opened up. The Figaro's got an editorial on its front page talking about a democratic crisis, the fact that we are seeing protests as opposed to a narrative or a conversation between these two parties. It does look like the Interior Minister, a man called Christophe Castanet, may be thrown under the bus by the Macron government, and someone who has maybe a more or a longer held stance of law and order, and maybe a more experienced civil servant would take over in his place. But Macron needs to do something because his opinion polling is awful at the moment. It's on Trumpian levels, you'd have to say.
When he was elected, you know, this brand new leader, 40 years of age, of a new party in France, I mean, it was seen as quite a move behind him, getting a strong majority in the French Parliament. It was seen that he could maybe implement change, that leaders before him, François Hollande, Nicolas Sarkozy, were not able to do so. And everybody knew it wouldn't be easy, but this is maybe something he would not predict in terms of the level of protests, the fact that they're widespread. It's many groups. It's not one particular union, and it started out about fuel tax that was, you know, becoming more and more widespread, just sort of sucking up all sorts of issues that people have issues with in France.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether he goes back to, let's say, the Socialist Party and the La République Party, the centre-left and the centre-right.